All right, joining us once again is our man within the first island chain, our favorite expat in Singapore, Blake Herzinger. Blake, great to see you again.
Hey, Ward, thanks for having me back.
So let's get right to it. This week, Xi visited Moscow. So what are your initial thoughts around that event?
Well, it's an interesting one, Ward, and I think it kind of shows Xi Jinping's true colors, right? For the duration of Moscow's war on Ukraine, they've proclaimed this no limits partnership between Beijing and Moscow. We didn't know exactly how far it's going to go. Beijing keeps putting forth this 12-point peace plan, which is really just more of a list of nice to haves, like a list of thoughts that he had, and proclaiming kind of Chinese neutrality. I think it's fairly obvious that he's conducting state visits to Russia and he hasn't called Mr. Zelensky. I think it's pretty clear that they're not neutral here. Obviously, the last few weeks we've been hearing rumbles about potentially sending lethal aid to Russia as well. And then some reports that they've already been doing so. It highlights his Russian weakness coming out the other side of this. Vladimir Putin has shattered Russia's spear on Ukraine. They will forever be a failing middle power, and they're going to end up a very junior partner to Beijing.
So to that point, what is Xi's motivation to fortify this partnership in this way?
Vladimir Putin for Xi Jinping is kind of just one of this small group of people who refuse to kind of live by the same rules that the rest of the world wants to live by. You know, they're crying constantly about NATO expansion and bullying by these powers in the post-war order and pointing to foreign policy errors by Western states, particularly the United States. So he doesn't want to see Russia fall. He doesn't want to see an authoritarian state that sort of looks like him collapse in on itself. So it's in his interest to keep that alive, keep Russia on its feet. They also like buying cheap oil and gas off them. So I think we'll continue to see that. You know, we're seeing from the maritime side, you know, huge amounts of black oil basically being and when I say black, I mean it's in the dark fleet. These ships are totally off the grid, and you know that gas is making its way to China. It's sort of a axis of really bad dudes.
The first thing that emerged from their meeting was the statement where Xi told Putin, we want to respect sovereign borders. And so particularly the media jumped on this idea that, oh, this is what he's going to do. He's going to urge Putin to pull out of Ukraine. And then by the end of day 3, it was obvious when they released these 12 parts of this agreement that it had nothing to do with urging Putin to pull out of Ukraine. And further, Putin recently visited Mariupol for this photo op at night. He's driving his own car and he's touring some reconstruction where they've rebuilt at least one half of a city block of a totally destroyed city. Obviously, Putin doesn't seem interested in pulling out anytime soon. And it doesn't seem like Xi mentioned that to him in spite of that initial sort of tenet of their get together. The other thing that's happening is there was recently an exercise in the Gulf of Oman that involved the other moving part in this axis of bad dudes, which is Iran. So they did a naval exercise, which they called a search and rescue exercise. I guess they plan on getting their ship sunk if we do go to war, if that's your focus. But it was China, Russia, and Iran. So what are we to make of that? What is Iran's part in this?
Again, kind of filling out this axis of states that don't want to see the people that look like them fall apart. We've seen Iran providing lethal aid to Russia, obviously in the form of one-way, you know, unmanned vehicles. The irony that I've enjoyed, though, is the idea that we may be sending weapons that the Iranians have been illegally exporting into Yemen and other places, and that we've been shipping those into Ukraine to be used against the Russians. I don't know if that plan took hold or is being operationalized, but I really hope it is, and I think that would be really nice. But seeing those three navies together, you know, is just really a statement that, hey, these are three states that disagree fundamentally with how the world looks. They don't agree with the way the rules are being employed. They don't agree with kind of this U.S.-led order, and they want to see kind of their own regional spheres of influence respected and maintained, and they don't want to deal with the U.S. as a power in the regions that they see as their own. So yeah, I think we'll continue to see that in whatever form the three can muster. Obviously, Iran, their navy can get maybe one ship much past the Arabian Sea. The Russians, who knows how many they'll have left by the end of this. But you're seeing these competing architectures. You see a lot of citations of the BRICS, even though India is very much not a part of the war in Ukraine. They're not enthusiastic about what China's doing. They're not enthusiastic about what the Iranians are up to. So yeah, you're going to keep seeing activism from the three.
I think, and this is a cliche, the glue of the three is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, because you look at those three and you go, okay, what do they have in common? Not a whole lot. Basically, the two sides that have kind of coalesced before us since the Russian invasion of Ukraine a year ago is the rules-based world order, US, NATO, versus totalitarian states that oppose the rules-based world order.
And I think we've got to maybe carve out a third for, the ones who don't want to be involved. Like, hey, look, we don't want a side in this, and we see it happening. We see these kind of competing blocks, and I think there's a lot of states that fall in there. I think the defaulters on world order are few, but unfortunately, two of them are nuclear powers, and the third one's seeking it. But you're right. I mean, the Iranians and the Chinese have traded weapons illicitly a lot in the past. That's happened a lot. We see it now with Iran, Russia. Russia has sold plenty of weapons to the Chinese. Most of China's more sophisticated platforms are kind of Russian knockoffs, well, Chinese knockoffs of Russian systems. So we see a lot of that. And they do have kind of a dislike of us in common, certainly. But, China's been able to wield this to their advantage in places like the Middle East, where they just got the Saudis and Iranians to normalize relations. And that's something the United States could never have done, which kind of makes it easier for them to gad about the Middle East now, because they've kind of pulled off this, foreign policy coup, getting these two states to, at least in theory, shake hands and somewhat normalize relations. Although, I think it's still going to be pretty tense.
So give me an example of that third way, a nation that represents the stay out of it.
I think most of Africa is totally disinterested. Southeast Asia is entirely disinterested for the most part. They have seen this kind of global competition play out before in the Cold War. A lot of the Cold War went hot in Southeast Asia. Places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they want nothing to do with it. So you see states like ASEAN that have actually come down on the side of international law, certainly, saying Russia should get out of Ukraine, which was great for the ASEAN states for the most part to do that. And surprisingly, even states like Cambodia, where the United States has some rough relations, even Cambodia got on board with saying Russia needs to stop and get out. But at the same time, they're not signing up to join a US-led grouping that opposes China, and they're not standing up to join China against the US either. They said, look, we want to trade. We want to create a prosperous environment for our own people. We don't want wars. We don't want that kind of competition.
And the reason I asked the question is because of global trade. It's going to be hard to stay out of it if it goes kinetic. It's going to affect your GNP, whether you want to be involved or not.
And I think Ukraine proved that, right? That should have proved it to everyone. Ukraine, how does Ukraine affect Southeast Asia? Probably no one could have answered that. But immediately when you realize that things like fertilizer, a huge amount of the world's food supply, every country has these things, and you can't fight a war and not affect the globalized economy. It just doesn't work.
We've kind of looked at these two fronts, if you will, the war in Ukraine versus the threat of China invading Taiwan, as two different things. And there are a lot of navalists and pundits in our circles who've written a lot lately about, hey, we got to keep our eye on the ball, and that ball is China. And, Secretary Austin's pacing threat and so forth and so on. But I think what all of the events we're talking about introduces is the notion that these aren't two things, it's one thing. And that's further reinforced by the fact that Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida just visited with Ukrainian President Zelensky. It's like, what's his motivation to do that? Also against the backdrop of the Japanese Defense Forces now being allowed, for the first time since MacArthur was the viceroy of Japan, to build its defense in a way that isn't just defensive.
Prime Minister Kishida at last year's Shangri-La dialogue said something incredibly impactful. You know, he stood up to give these remarks, and he was very measured, but he was quite grave. And he said, look, I am concerned that today's Ukraine could tomorrow be East Asia. And so I think it's very clear that Asian countries are looking at Ukraine and seeing that territorial aggression, acts of imperialism are not done. The history didn't end, and they don't want to see this kind of thing go unpunished. They don't want to see this incentivize other revisionist actors to attack countries outside their borders. They don't want to see, the rules rewritten based on force. That's the whole reason that we created all these post-war structures, to resolve things through negotiation and the rule of law. People were tired of millions of people dying in wars every year for thousands of years of human history. So you're absolutely right. And I couldn't agree less with those that say, well, we can't think about Ukraine. We should be doing less. We need to think about Taiwan. Taiwan is as terrible as it would be, it's still a hypothetical. We don't know if, we don't know when. Ukraine is happening now. There are women and children being murdered in the streets in Ukraine, and the United States is in a position to do something about that and inflict extreme costs on the aggressor. And we've done that, and we've marshaled our allies to do that. And at a very practical level, those that oppose it should maybe look at the fact that this has woken up the U.S. defense industrial base, the U.S. Congress, to the deficiencies in our magazines. And they've said, you know what? Maybe we will start doing some of those multi-year buys. Maybe we will start buying more naval strike missiles. Maybe we will start producing more artillery shells. Because yes, we're giving a lot to Ukraine, but hey, we've got a lot of customers that include Taiwan. And as a result of the Ukraine war, Lockheed Martin's making more HIMARS. They're making more Gimlers. All the things that Taiwan wants to buy, we're making more of them because we're supporting the Ukrainians. So even if you don't agree morally, you should agree practically.
And when we look at the motivation for China to invade Taiwan, as we've discussed in previous episodes, we've talked about the Davidson window, where Admiral Phil Davidson testified that he thought it was, and this was back, 20 whatever, when he said this, 2020. And so he's like, okay, by 2026, it was a 6-year window.
Yeah.
Or 2027. We've also talked about the reasons emotionally, traditionally, historically, that China would want to do that. And that's, Chiang and Kai-shek and the nationalists versus the communists. And the communists and Mao's regime never considered Taiwan a sovereign nation. It's always been part of China. There's that level. And the other level is they're not financially incentivized to do it because of their financial entanglements, let's call it, in global markets, both trade and in terms of investment. So I have this graphic that shows they peaked in terms of investment in America in 2016, and they've come down since then. But it's still high, right? It's still 3.2 billion. But let's talk about trade.
The graphic you're pointing out with investment in the United States, maybe China's pulling some of that back. Obviously, we got COVID in there too. But the U.S. has also gotten tougher to invest in because we've recognized that Chinese investment often comes with, some fine print, things that we don't like. And we also woke up to issues like investment in critical infrastructure and critical sectors of our economy, which our partners like in Australia have done the same thing. We just saw the Germans lease an immense piece of a port to the Chinese. The Greeks have done it. So most countries have woken up to this, that they're not that keen on Chinese investment. But we're still doing record numbers in trade between the United States and China. A war in Taiwan, if we think that the war in Ukraine has affected the global economy, and it certainly has, but if everyone remembers the supply chain slowdowns, when shipping was kind of backed up and we couldn't get containers, and things like semiconductors started slowing down, which most of the advanced ones come out of Taiwan. You couldn't buy a fridge because there weren't enough semiconductors to make your fridge, which has a bunch of chips in it. You couldn't buy an iPhone. You couldn't buy a car because all this stuff takes things that Taiwan makes. Now, China invades Taiwan. It doesn't take, TSMC, the company making these chips, and just start immediately turning chips out the next day. The war probably takes months, and is going to be immensely destructive. You talk about Mariupol. I mean, China's got hundreds of ballistic missiles lined up all over Taiwan. This would be an immensely destructive war. The global economy, everything's dependent on a semiconductor, grinds to a halt in weeks. It won't even just be that there aren't ships to move them, which ships won't be able to get there either. But there won't be any ships to move. So, Beijing, to do this would be taking an immense kick at the global economy. The backlash that we've seen against the Russians would be, I can only imagine, tenfold against China for what it would do to the GDP of every country in the world.
The other thing that I want to talk about is the 60 Minutes episode that just aired on Sunday that was kind of an amazing promo for the U.S. Navy. This featured my good friend Admiral Sam Paparo, who is the Pacific Fleet Commander. We've talked about him on the channel before. He is a former Tomcat Super Hornet guy, and he's one of the good ones that has made it. I'm very proud of Sam's rise, and I saw him at Tailhook last year, and we caught up. And he's nobody's fool. He's not a political actor. He believes in what he does, and he was on message. So let me quote a few things that he said in this episode, and we can talk about whether he's right and what we need to do in the event that he's not right or he wasn't fully truthful about what he said. So the reporter was Nora O'Donnell. She was the one out there aboard the Nimitz that's on deployment in the Western Pacific. And so Nora asks Sam, Admiral Paparo, China has accused the United States of trying to contain them. What do you say to China? And so Admiral Paparo says, I would say, do you need to be contained? Are you expanding? Are you an expansionist power?
Boss move. That's
a brilliant way to reframe it, right? To a very great extent, the United States was a champion for China's rise. I mean, you talk about shifting the logic. I mean, this is like a judo move. And in no way are we seeking to contain China, but we are seeking for them to play by the rules. So this gets back to what we were talking about in terms of the international rules-based order. So that's point one. She asks, do the numbers matter? And Sam says, yes, as the saying goes, quantity has a quality all its own. So that's, I guess you were saying that's maybe a Stalin quote.
I think he used it too, which makes a lot of sense. But that's classic war college stuff, right? I mean, this is the age of naval missile warfare. He who shoots most pretty good first probably wins. And if you've got 350 shooters and you're dealing with, 200 and I don't know, what are we now? 90? You got good odds. You don't have to have a whole bunch of, Arleigh Burkes in the water. You could have something good enough. And really, if you can afford to lose it, good for you. And we don't have that. And we don't have the shipyard capacity to build that, which is where we're struggling. We've got 4 public shipyards. China's got like 7 out of 10 of the largest in the world. They're cranking out ships faster than anyone.
So she does bring that up and around carriers. So she says they have their own version of an aircraft carrier, and Sam points out they have 2, the third one on the way. We have 11. So that's one place where we're still very far ahead. And as we've talked about on other episodes, it'll be interesting to watch China's trajectory as they try to get into the world of conventional fixed-wing carriers. As you said, their shipyard capacity is much greater than ours. Their industrial base is healthier than ours. That's not an unknown to us, so we'll see what happens.
There's a lot of chat that the carrier is dead. The carrier is dead. Long live the carrier. Well, the Chinese building them doesn't mean it's relevant for the future. But I think you have to look at the CONOPS there. Like how do they think about using an aircraft carrier? Do they need 11 super carriers? No, because they think if they're going to fight us, they're going to fight probably close enough to home that they don't need 11 aircraft carriers. They have islands all over the South China Sea that they can fly fighters and bombers off of. Those islands don't move. They don't have to, feed 5,000 people to keep those islands in one piece. And then they've got the Chinese mainland as well. And their main military objective in the entire, in the entirety of Chinese strategic thought, their main objective is 90 miles offshore. They don't have to go around the world to do what they want to do, and we do.
It's a good point. They're expansionists, but there's a limit, second island chain, let's say, to their expansion. But still, they are a threat. And so this is the last point here with her questions. Let's talk about this, because again, his answer is from a messaging standpoint, pretty brilliant. So Nora O'Donnell asked, and if China invades Taiwan, what will the U.S. Navy do? And Sam says, it's a decision of the President of the United States and a decision of the Congress. It's our duty to be ready for that, but the bulk of the United States Navy will be deployed rapidly to the Western Pacific to come to the aid of Taiwan if the order comes to aid Taiwan in thwarting that invasion. And she asks, is the U.S. Navy ready? And this is really a good non-answer that seems to be definitive, but then you like try to grab it, you're like, hold it. So he says, we're ready, yes. I'll never admit to being ready enough. So that kind of sounds like we're not ready.
You know, I'm happy that Admiral Paparo obviously avoided kind of the easy hubris answer there. You know, like, of course we're ready. We know the greatest Navy in the world, which, you know, of course, as a part of that Navy, like, I do believe we're the greatest Navy in the world. But, you know, he did leave that room. Like, yeah, you know, I'd sure like to have more. I think that's what I hear when I hear that. I would like to have more. I'd like to have what we're asking for. You know, I'd like to have some more shipyards. I'd like to have repair capacity. I'd like to not have lost my biggest fuel depot. You know, Red Hill. You know, gosh, what would I not like to have? Like, it'd be great if we could even just build 2 submarines a year instead of like 1.2.
The other thing is obviously Admiral Paparo's answer, as well as saying 2 things at once, is also acquisitions defense budget facing. You know, you can't say we're good, because at that point the HASC and the SASC will, you know, zero out any budget growth. And not that $825 billion is any small amount, but, you know, baked into a defense budget. And so when you hear a defense budget is being cut, what that means is the growth of it year over year is being reduced. You know, even during what was it called during the Obama administration when we were cutting the budget?
Sequestration.
Sequestration, right? So during sequestration, we were like, oh my God, the defense budget. And then when you actually dug into the numbers, like, no, actually what's happening is they've reduced the amount of growth year over year. That's what passes for a cut, you know, on K Street and within the Beltway. Certainly, he's a steward of that. You know, again, his motivations as a warfighter. He's not a man trained and equipped guy. He's not N98. He's not in the Pentagon currently. So he cares about the fight part. But he always has this fiduciary responsibility to attend to the pressure put on the budget battle, right? So I think he did a good job of making sure that that was part of the messaging as well. But again, it's amazing to my eye, a guy who's been on both sides of that fence as a, you know, defense spokesman and then also as an editor of a military website on a few occasions. It's just amazing to me that the Navy got that coverage. It's great, I guess, right? I mean, that's good stuff. So, Blake, it's late where you are. I know you've been burning your candle at both ends. It's a great conversation as always. Thanks for the time, and we look forward to seeing you on the channel again very soon.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Ward, and go Navy.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, click the button and ring the bell so you don't miss anything going forward. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/Ward Carroll. And don't forget our newsletter. The Mooch Report comes out every Tuesday, chock full of good intel about all going on around the military and on my channel. So check the episode description for more on that. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.